In this lecture, we're going to understand the boundaries of the firm, which simply talks about when to incorporate some process into your own firm or when to use the market. So we think of two problems every society must face. We've talked about the social dilemma, and that is first the information problem. How do we allocate resources most efficiently? How do we utilize resources most effectively, most profitably? And incentives. How do we get people to act in the interests of everyone? And so if information was perfect and people motivated to serve society's better interests, there's no need for markets. Everything would be happening automatically. There's no need for markets. We'd understand who values what, and people had the right incentives to produce what. But we need the market in order to solve that problem. It's spontaneous order that directs us through prices and profits, and that coordinates our behavior and gets us to do things. However, when we look at things, why do we have firms? If this is true, markets are so good, then why do we have firms? A firm is a command and control system where you have different levels of management directing people what to do and how to act. And you would think that this would be, lack of information and poor incentives. This happens every time with firms. But because markets are not costless to operate, they have transactions costs, we tend to use command and control systems. My family operates the same way. We don't have a market-based system in my family. It's a command and control system where one or two people talk about what should be done, and things are coordinated basically through, altruistic benevolence or through dictating, whatever it is. We don't use markets in my family. So the question is, when do we use a market and when do we bring it in-house? When does Ford, why does Ford manufacture its own engines, but it buys its tires from Firestone and other tire producers? Why does it manufacture its own tires? Similarly, why do accounting firms operate? Why does every firm have its own accounting department? Why do some firms, smaller firms especially, use an accounting firm instead? And lastly, why does a university have its own print shop, but it buys its paper and pencils and things like that from an external source? It really comes to something Ronald Coase looked at in 1937. He asked the question, why not have just one big, huge firm that employs 150 million people, let's say? Or, on the opposite end, why not have 150 million individuals, each operating as their sole independent firm, and they simply sell their services and goods in the market? And what he found out is transactions costs impede that. There are cost of transacting in markets that makes it much easier and cheaper to simply bring something in-house and direct it from the owners or management of the firm. We call this transactions cost theory of the firm. We have information asymmetries. Who knows what to do, when to do it. We have search costs. We have to go out and find certain goods or find certain people. We have contracting costs. When contracts are easy to specify, that's one thing, but contracts might be very, very difficult to specify. Enforcing those contracts can be costly. We're going to look at what's called post-investment holdup and asset specificity. That can impede a contract from actually taking place. And then we also look at something like quality verification. These can be costly. We'd also have a couple of other things. We look at transportation costs. Things like that will impede the market from operating as efficiently as it could, and it's cheaper to bring something in-house. So let's take a look at the firm size. On this horizontal axis, we're going to look at the firm size. It goes from smaller to bigger. And on the vertical axis, we'll have the cost. And we'll start with the internal coordinating costs as the firm gets bigger. So when the firm gets bigger, the internal coordination costs increase. This means things like employee shirking, monitoring, information problems within the firm. They increase as the firm gets bigger in size. So you can imagine a firm with 60,000 people. You're going to be dealing with information problems, you're going to be dealing with shirking, you're going to be dealing with coordination costs within the firm. So that increases as the firm gets bigger. As the firm gets bigger, however, you're reducing the external coordination costs, the cost of using the market. We're not having to contract with different people, we're not having to negotiate, we're not having to search, we have everything in-house. So these two costs compete against each other. The external coordination costs are decreasing in firm size, the internal coordination costs are increasing in firm size. And so we can see that we want to minimize both the internal and external costs of coordinating or operating within the firm. And this becomes the optimal size of a firm. And if you look at some firms, like I said, a university produces education, a university produces Oftentimes lecture series. A university will produce its own, well, will actually market its own food, but the university uses the market to do things like paper or pens. It uses the market for other things. The vehicles that are used to operate or transport people to, uh, the administrators, or buses to a basketball game. So these are the internal and external coordination costs, and this tells us what's the optimal size of a firm. So when a transaction is pretty simple, if the costs are relatively small, it's okay to use the market. When I go to the grocery store or I go to a farmer's market, I can easily measure the quality of a carrot or the lettuce. I don't need to bring something in-house if I'm a grocer. I will use the market for my raw ingredients, or a restaurant, I'll use the market for my raw ingredients, for my main ingredients. I don't necessarily have to grow my own. Some do, they do it as a niche market. For the most part, most people will use the market to buy something like groceries. They can measure the quality. Other times, large costs are encountered. If it's a big contracting problem, if it's a quality measurement, then I'm going to probably bring something in-house. So when costs are small, use the market, but when prohibitive, bring the operation in-house. Let's looking at using the market here. One thing, the first is, why do universities not produce their own pens and paper? It's economies of scale. It doesn't pay for one firm or for 50 firms to operate. It pays for maybe one or two firms. Or it doesn't pay for every university to have its own textbook publishing. It pays to have a textbook publisher that sells to all universities around the world. And that's economies of scale. That simply means the long-run average total cost is declining within that range of output. So this is why firms don't produce their own pencils and papers, and why they don't always have their own accounting services. But one thing you must avoid is the diseconomies of scale. That's to the right, you see where the average total cost increases, and that is caused a lot of times by firms being too big because they lack information problems, and their coordination costs get too high. The example of this is Mrs. Fields Cookies. Mrs. Fields Cookies started out small. They had a few little franchises within the local area. As they expanded, they actually went too far. They were trying to collectivize all the decision making within the corporate office, including what should be produced, how much should be produced, when it should be produced. The dough was made locally and then shipped to all these other franchises. And as they did that, the cost became too great and they suffered from diseconomies of scale. When information and search costs are low, use the market. When we can verify the quality of a tire, it's pretty easy. So we use the market for tires. If those information problems are high, we want to bring it in-house, such as measuring the quality of an engine or a transmission, something like that. We want to bring something like that in-house when information costs are high. Bringing something in-house, though, can be costly. Again, you have agency costs, monitoring, and shirking. The bigger you get in-house, then those costs become high, so you want to use the market for as much as possible. You want to minimize the internal coordination costs, which can be information problems, the shirking. Then we have diseconomies of scale, diseconomies of scope, and increasing information problems. And again, this is especially true within a vertical hierarchy. When you have a command and control system from above, many firms are going more to a horizontal hierarchy. So looking at a contract, if a contract specifies today what is expected of two or more parties tomorrow or some other time in the future, the more difficult it is to specify those future states of the world, the more you want to bring that in-house. If it's pretty easy or it's a standard contracting issue, you can use the market. So for example, a rental car contract is a pretty standard agreement. Deciding how to produce, a building, for example, so the construction of a building, that can be pretty complex, but you can pretty much state what's to be done and who takes responsibility. But other contracts become far more specific, such as if I'm looking at a General Motors contract for the actual specifications of an engine, how it should run, who's going to take on the responsibilities, it might be easier to bring that in-house. So looking at bringing production in-house, let's look at one of these first things, and if it's a core competency of a business, you want to bring that in-house. A restaurant does not farm out its prepared foods. It brings it in-house because that's its core competency, that's its brand. It's trying to sell that brand. It doesn't want to use the market for things that it brings out somebody else's brand. One other thing we want to look at is something called post-investment holdup. This simply means when you've set up a contract and you've signed an agreement, and the other party has to incur a sunk cost in fulfilling the obligation or their end of that agreement, then there's an incentive for the other party to use what's called post-investment holdup, which is now renegotiate a contract. So, for example, General Motors contracts with Fisher Auto Body to produce 35,000 Corvette bodies. In doing so, Fisher must invest $20 million in developing a metal stamping, which is a fixed cost for the company, and this only applies to the Corvette automobile. So it's not as if they can create a mold in the stamp and use it elsewhere. This $20 million is not only a fixed cost, it's a sunk cost. Once they're done, this stamp is done. So they agree to invest the $20 million, and the variable cost is going to be $2,000 per car for a total cost of $90 million for producing 35,000 Corvette bodies. Both companies agree that GM will pay Fisher Auto Body $3,000 a car for these parts, and therefore that'll be a $105 million revenue. Fisher Auto Body is going to make a $15 million profit. Now, once Fisher Auto Body incurs that $20 million cost, it is sunk, and GM now has an incentive to come back and renegotiate the contract and say, that $20 million is really sunk. You're not going to get it back. We could walk away from this whole thing and you're out $20 million. How about we renegotiate our contract to $2,500 or $2,400? In which case, Fisher Auto Body may lose money, but it's better off losing some money than losing the $20 million. So when something like this happens, and by the way, it can happen the other way too, Fisher Auto Body, knowing full well that GM is set for production and it has to have that production done, it needs those body parts to do this in order to roll out its Corvette, can simply do the same thing and want to renegotiate the contract and say, you need these to get your production going. We want to do it for $3,500 a body. So because of this post-investment holdup, a contracting problem, it's easier to bring the operation in-house. So many of these situations that arise can increase the market transactions cost, can impede using the market, and we want to bring something in-house. Other times we'd rather use the market because that increases if we don't use the market, bringing it in-house will increase our internal coordination costs. It's finding that right balance of internal and external coordination costs that give you the optimal size of the firm. This is the end of this lecture. We'll move on to another one.